Sounds good.
All right. Hey, Shannon. So great to have you on today.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here, Angela. Thank you for having me.
So I love the perspective that you're bringing. It's kind of a shakeup of the status quo of the corporate world. But can you tell us a little bit more about what made you become a corporate culture expert? What were the gaps you saw, and what are you doing that you feel is really shifting things?
Thank you. So I come from corporate. I was in the corporate world for too long. No, I worked for an advertising agency, a recruitment advertising agency for a very long time. I was with them for a while, and when I was there, the company treated me very well. I did great work there. I grew there. I learned there. But what I saw there, especially because I think some commonalities between advertising, I think there are some commonalities between advertising and architecture in that we both service clients with kind of high demands and lots of deadlines, and sometimes they're reasonable and sometimes they're not. And also between advertising and architecture, people in both of those industries are asked to wear so many different hats and to toggle between them, right? One minute it's creativity and the other minute it's analytics. So there's a lot of parallels there, which is why I'm really loving being in support of the architecture folks in architecture and the leadership in that space. The where I saw the gap in that world and why I really wanted to do this work is ultimately comes down to psychological safety and uh, openness and what I call conscious leadership. And I'm definitely borrowing that term. There's plenty of people out there who talk and do a lot of great work in the conscious leadership space. But conscious leadership, although it sounds maybe fancy and lofty and complicated, it really just comes down to being a human being at work. And how can we break down some of those silos and barriers in a way that makes people feel like they can bring their whole selves to work, so they feel like they belong? And when you feel like you belong in a trusting environment, guess what? You're going to do really great work. You're probably going to stay for longer than you would otherwise. You're going to refer people into the practice because you love your job. So yeah, that's kind of a long-winded answer. I'm sorry, but I just kind of wanted to humanize the workplace a little bit more. And we're not there yet, but we're people like you and me, thankfully, are putting one foot in front of the other and doing our best.
Yeah, I think it's so important what you said about the psychological safety, because especially in a creative profession, you don't know you got the right answer. There's so many different ways to approach a problem, let alone to solve the problem. So feeling like it's okay to fail and okay to try something new, it's really important to success.
100%. Yes, absolutely. Nothing more to add there. I think you said that beautifully.
So, a lot of your work is in facilitating team building and collaboration, but you like to tailor that to an individual culture. And, what do you find is the hardest part of that? Where are you finding the resistance or the desire to kind of go back to doing it the old way that people are used to?
Yeah, it depends on the situation. It can come from a couple different places. Ideally, when doing work like this, or anyone in our shared space who are doing leadership development, it always benefits us to start with the people, the management level, the CEOs, the executives, or if we're not dealing with the C-suite, then if it's a small firm and there's 10 people, who's the decision maker? Because at the end of the day, those folks are the ones who are modeling ultimately what the rest of the culture is going to be like here. And guess what? Culture exists whether we build it or not, right? It exists, but how can we influence it? And the best way to do that is to start, I am using big air quotes, at the top. Now, ideally, you're dealing with a more democratic setup and structure, but that's not always the case. So sometimes there's resistance there. Sometimes those folks that are the decision makers will say, oh, you know what, this is a little touchy feely. we'll do one workshop and then everything will be resolved. And they will sort of, kind of kick you down to somebody else who's a little bit more on the ground, which is a great place to be. But if we're going to have meaningful and lasting change, those folks really need to be in the room throughout the entire process, because everybody else in the firm or in the practice in the company is looking to those people no matter what, right? They're looking to those people to say, are you also buying into this? Because if you are, I am. And that's really where that stickiness is going to be. I'd say in my experience too, in architecture, specifically in architecture, what's interesting is when you've got this, there's a little bit of and it's not a negative tension. So I'm saying tension in a healthy way as well, but there's a little bit of that tension between folks that have been in the business and have, potentially decades of experience ahead of them, and folks who are new. And they're ready and they're green and they're smart and they're technically savvy and they're hungry. And sometimes there can be a little bit of a tension there between, folks who are like, well, but it's been fine. If it's not broken, why are we fixing it? And the new folks who are saying, well, but look how amazing we can make it if only we push, pulled these levers and invested a little bit more in our culture. So there can be a little bit of an uphill climb there too.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that, because when you are newer, you want to prove yourself too. So
Yeah.
you want to maybe even overperform a little bit, whereas somebody who's more established might be saying, you're making more work or you're burning too many hours on the project.
Yes.
This way works. This is efficient. So I
Yes.
think unpacking some of the this is how we do it stuff can be tricky.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I know that that's not unique to architecture. It's just because we're talking about this as a practice, that's certainly relevant. But that can be tricky. And, if you've got the ambassadors, if you're intentional in coming in and building the culture and having conversations with the right people and going through the motions that I'm happy to describe in terms of the phases of how this work sort of unfolds, um, you can get those people on board. Sometimes it's a matter of, pulling them aside and looking to them as the experts. Hey, you've been here a long time. Would you mind if I asked you to really serve as an ambassador for this work? It would really mean a lot to me and the rest of the people here who look up to you. Because A, that's true. And B, what a great way to elevate someone and make them feel like they're part of it and they have skin in the game.
Yeah, that's important, that they don't feel like you're just ignoring the value they bring.
Right.
Because a lot of times that is why people feel fear change, is that they think that you don't appreciate everything they've done and you just want to switch it out for the shiny penny that's new and all of that.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, so that really gets kind of back to that whole culture and building a culture that feels inclusive, where everyone feels seen and feels heard. So, what is your process to help somebody model their culture, or maybe better define or even tweak their culture?
Yeah. So in my experience, it starts with values. And a lot of companies already have their values. So it's not always about coming in and creating something out of nothing, right? Sometimes it's, well, we already know what those values are. Well, great. Let's work with what we know and take that work and really solidify. If we know what the values are, how do we behavioralize them, right? What sort of routines and norms and rituals are we going to put into practice so that everyone knows what it looks and feels like to, for example, demonstrate trust? Or what does it look and feel like in this company to, I'm making up these values, but to, be creatively resilient, right? So it's not just putting up these flashy values so that your website looks great. This is about really identifying, how are we going to shift our onboarding program? What are we going to do to build awareness about ourselves as a firm that people want to work for so that we can identify the right talent? What do we need to do from a DEIB perspective? Do we need to bring experts in so that we really walk the walk? What do we want to do with our retention and learning and development exercises? But to do that, all kind of bringing all that work into alignment with those values so that those values really serve as a true north and really kind of buoy all that other work. So it starts with values and then kind of nicely parlays into some of those shifts and evolutions of what the culture should look like here. And I want to also just really emphasize how important it is to do this, especially if you have a small team, to do this in a group. This is not something where, XYZ leader goes into a corner office somewhere and then comes out and says, ta-da, we have a culture. That is just not going to work. And I know I'm preaching to the choir on some of this stuff. It really needs to be co-created, and for everyone to let's get out the sticky notes and have a super engaging conversation where we identify what's really meaningful here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say it's a lot of that buy-in or opt out. If you don't feel like you were part of creating it, now you feel like you can judge it and choose to just not do it that way.
Yes, exactly. So that's part of the process. And, depending on what the needs and the objectives are and where we're starting and where we need to go, these services and the way that I support my clients can look like a couple different things. It can be that full-fledged kind of larger strategy. Or maybe it's just a half-day session to really get people kind of on their feet, thinking about what is most meaningful to them, so that I step away and they're off and running and they carry their own culture and do the work internally. So it really just depends on what the need is and kind of what the long-term goal is in terms of coming to someone like me for this type of support.
So you could have two firms that were similarly sized and worked in the same markets, but because they may have different values, their cultures could look very different. I'm wondering if you could maybe give an example of that to sort of help people get their head around it.
Yeah. So let me think. So you could have two different companies, and I've seen this a little bit more in the startup world, so I might just use that as an example, but it's still similar in terms of a smaller company that's scaling and starting to focus on people. And on the one hand, so you've got two companies that are both similarly sized, similar markets, similar clientele, similar types of services that are software based or tech based, and one has a real kind of like a little bit more of a masculine culture, I guess I would say, where some of the values are around striving and winning and being big and being bold. So, you might hear words like audacious and win and ahead of the game, right? And then you might have another firm or another organization who has a softer feel, right? They're still appealing to the same types of customers and their product line is similar, but they're softer or they're more inclusive. And it's not about winning and beating the competition and using all these really hard-edged words that oftentimes can be off-putting depending on who you're trying to attract and what kind of culture you want to build. On the other hand, you might have around inclusivity and they can still be competitive sounding words that mean dominance in the market without having all those kind of forceful energy behind them. Because once you start to put those things into play and then attach the behaviors to each of those two different value sets, you're really looking at very different cultures. Because when you go to market and try to attract talent for the one versus trying to attract talent for the other, and even how you talk to clients and expect these folks to kind of synergize and support their clientele, you're going to have very different results because you're really you've now created two very different types of vibe within each of these organizations. Um, and it's not always based solely on their values. It's also very much based on the leadership, and it's based on sort of what the day-to-day feel of how the communication flow goes and whether or not there's status and hierarchy. And trust, right? Trust is really at the core of how making sure that any of this stuff works in the first place.
Right. So certain employees may resonate with one place versus the other, and it will affect recruitment and retention. So you mentioned leadership, and a lot of firms are smaller firms, or
Yeah.
even if they are larger, they have to transition between generations of leadership. So, how can you help a culture transition so there's still some continuity there?
From the legacy to the kind of the evolution of yeah, yeah. That's a really great question. I think that starts with, and I actually have a free download that I'm going to offer your listeners, and I can mention that in a little bit, but they are 5 tips for inspiring a people first culture. And I'll just give a little spoiler alert. The first, the first tip is to have a CEO chat. And you can replace the word CEO with anything, right? CEO, you can be principal, right? Founder. But the idea is, so often organizations are run and the employees are expected to sort of buy into this mission and vision without providing an opportunity for the principal of the firm, let's say, to literally sit on a stool in front of their people with a cup of coffee or tea in their hands and a box of donuts open on the counter and just tell their story. Why are we here? Why do we do this work? Why is it that we choose some projects and not others? Why did we choose the name that we chose, right? Where are we headed? Where have we been? Transparency, transparency, transparency. And that will go such a long way in terms of building trust with your people. And B, it really gives a chance of everyone to sort of have that look back and a deep appreciation for the legacy of the firm. And then to take a breath after having reflected on that and then say, okay, but here we are today. So what do we want to do now, right? We don't want to lose what we've had. In fact, we want to honor that. So what are some ways that we can continue to honor where we've been and take us where we're going, right? It's a both and scenario.
Mm.
Yeah, because, and you're right. I hear this all the time, is this deep appreciation for the legacy of the work. And a recognition of wanting to move forward. So it's holding both of those things. And the CEO chat is just one of many ways to do that. But I just recently helped facilitate one of these chats. And oh my goodness, you could just feel the neurons moving in the room because this principal literally sat on a stool and was just like, here I am, here's my story. And he also talked about his own, how did he go through his own licensing process and where did he goof up and where were his mistakes made? And look at him now. And then now we're moving forward. But we have that story to sort of root us in the legacy of where they've been.
Yeah, that's such a great strategy because it humanizes the person. A lot of times we only see people where they are now,
Right.
and we think they've always been that way. We don't see that evolution. So I think that's a really great way to understand that they were where you are at one time.
Yeah.
And things that looked like mistakes worked out, and things that they thought would work out turned out to be failures, and how you just keep going.
Exactly. I call that the highlight reel, right? It's sort of a nod to Instagram, but it's so easy for us to get caught up in looking at people and thinking, oh my goodness, they have it all figured out. When in actuality, to your point, no, they're human. So they fell down and they got back up just like you did. But to hear it with that level of transparency can be really pretty awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, really powerful. Now, What if we are at the other end of the spectrum, the firm that is starting up, it's small, maybe it's just one person at the beginning, and that one person is wearing even more hats because they're also the bookkeeper, the HR, but the operations. How do you know when it's time to begin adding these, I call them outside experts, even though they may be consultants you hire, or they may be employees eventually of the firm, but they're not somebody with an architecture degree? How do you know that you need to bring in that level of expertise rather than trying to DIY it?
Yeah, really good question. Well, I'd say just because you're looking at a solopreneur right here, right? So I am those things that you just described, so I can speak to it from that perspective too. But I'd say even before you reach out and reach out to a consultant or an expert who's going to come in that you're going to potentially pay a good deal of money to come in and help you formulate this culture. I'd almost say, honestly, there are so many beautiful communities of people that are designed to support entrepreneurs who are scaling their business. I know that for small architecture firms, there's the Entree Architecture Group. I know you do a lot of work in this space. So, like, what are some ways that these folks that you're describing, these solopreneurs, maybe there's two, maybe three tops, these people, right? And they're doing residential work, and maybe they're even a husband and wife team, right? I mean, I know that there's such a predominant number of very small firms in this country. Um, so to do the work, recognize that it's important. I mean, and also not break the bank. I'd say to really do some research and find out who those communities of like-minded people are that are filled with other people who are also in your shoes. Because guess what? You're not alone. And it feels like you are because you're sitting in your office just like I am right now. I'm gesticulating, I'm moving my arms around this room, and it's just me. And but that doesn't mean that I'm the only one doing this work, right? And it's just a matter of sometimes it takes a little courage, but reaching out to people who are just a couple steps ahead of you, reaching out to communities of people who may have a couple years of experience, or bring experts and speakers in to talk about various topics that might be really helpful to you. Um, so I'd almost say that that's a good first step. And then after that, I would say, yeah, reach out to through referral, reach out to folks that you know who are coaches and experts and consultants that might be able to come in and do some work for you. And depending on your size, sometimes there's folks that will do it for a lot more, an economical rate that's not going to be prohibitive. Because at the end of the day, I like to say that, hey, if the pricing doesn't work at the onset, let's get creative, because what I don't want to do is walk away and know that you haven't gotten the support that you need. I'm so passionate about this that as long as I know that we've done something here to move a needle in the direction that feels good to your heart and your business, then we've done our job, right? So there's ways to scaffold that in a way that doesn't need to be so binary that it's like 0 to 100. There's 1,000 steps in between, and it's just a matter of getting a little creative and kind of identifying who those networks are that you might be able to plug into for help and support.
Yeah, that's so important. A lot of times people do think I can just do it myself.
Yeah.
And you do hit a scale, even if you are a sole proprietor, where you just can't afford the time it takes you. Plus, this isn't your wheelhouse.
Right.
So it's probably taking you longer, and your time has value. Just because you're not necessarily paying yourself a salary doesn't mean your time doesn't have value.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes.
So, no matter what scale your business is, what is the most important thing you want to leave people with so that their business can not just survive, but thrive?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, we just got through saying just a recognition that you're not alone. And although I'd say that despite the size of your practice, don't, my advice would be to just keep values and culture top of mind, because even as a solopreneur or a team of 2 or 3, there is work that you can do without big budgets and big strategy to define what that means for you. Because in 6 months, in 9 months, you might hire a contractor, or even partnering with third-party support like contractors of your own or engineers. What does it mean for those people to be entering into your culture, right? That's ultimately what they're doing. Every phone call, every time we're talking to these folks, they're entering into our culture by doing business with us. And there are small things that can be done to support those folks to create, thriving groups of people. And I showed this on an earlier conversation I had today. I mean, like I just got through saying, I'm a solo proprietor, and a little while ago, I'm just holding this up, I'm not going to read every word of it, but I created what I call my culture manifesto.
Mm.
And I used some prompts that I came up with on my own, and I wrote what it feels like to work here at Enliven Studios. And so when I'm ready to hire on people, this is what it feels like to work here. It's filled with color and laughter and creativity and swagger and making mistakes and joy. So there are ways to really keep culture and values top of mind every step of the way, even before you've got the budget and the strategy to back it up. And then when you do, and you are bringing in new people into the culture that you're starting to manifest as you grow your business, the way that you invite people into an environment where they're thriving versus just surviving is, I'd say, really allow them to show up and be themselves. Invite open conversation right from the very get-go. Ask them for their feedback every step of the way. Make sure that the steps that you're taking to grow your business and the clients you're choosing, the way you're fostering relationships with clients and doing your work resonates with those folks on your team. And the more you do that, and the more that conversation becomes a two-way conversation, you're going to have that psychological safety down pat right from the get-go.
Yeah. It's really about that authenticity. And if you have this in place, that clear intention before you even start, then you just keep building, but it's always coming from that core authenticity.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, so I know when we talked earlier, you had talked a little bit about some of the things you do that come from places outside of the business world, like improv, to try and get people to be more receptive to change, more receptive to what's possible. And I think it'd be so great if you could share some of that today.
Yeah, thank you. Um, yeah, so when I left the corporate world in 2017, I went back to taking improv classes as one of many things that I was doing at the time. And I'd grown up performing and doing improv. It had just been a long time. And I went back and started to take classes in San Francisco, and I went back just for the fun of it. But when I got into that theater and started to put into practice some of these principles of improv, the light bulb went off for me immediately, because some of most all the principles of improv theater, believe it or not, are very relevant and really have a significant place in business. And to connect those dots was really pivotal for me. So although I don't kind of market myself with the word improv or really go to market with that necessarily, I do bring in a lot of those concepts and kind of mindsets when I facilitate and when I talk about building culture. So one prominent improv concept that some of your listeners might be familiar with is the idea of yes and. And the idea of yes and is really important in performance, in performative improv, because if you have two people on a stage and one person says to the other person, Hey, mom, welcome home. Gosh, you're 20 minutes late. Where have you been? Well, the next improviser who comes in doesn't say, I'm not your mom. And, no, 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 no. They yes, and they agree. Okay, I'm the mom. Okay, clearly I'm 20 minutes late because that's what my co-actor has just designated me. So it's this idea of yes anding in order to move the story forward. Otherwise, the story stops dead in its tracks. Well, you take that to a meeting, you take that to a brainstorming session, or any sort of conceptual ideation conversation where you're kind of trying to come up with something new. And in partnership and collaboration environments like that, the yes and principle is so very useful because that's such a great way to go from that kind of divergent thinking where you kind of go way outside the boundaries. Let's think really big and get all those notes all over the wall and mess up the whiteboard and, think outside the box. And then you start to kind of, whittle it down and get a little bit more realistic about what can be done. But you'll never get to that new place without implementing much more of a growth mindset and an open-mindedness. And in improv, we refer to that as a yes and mindset. And there are a lot of other concepts from improv that are equally impactful. So yeah, I borrow from that a lot. And I do I sneak it in. I'm giving you a little wink. I sneak it in to my facilitation when I'm trying to get groups to sort of talk with one another in a way that's going to, again, move the story forward or get to a place where we agree. Or even if we don't agree, at least we're having conversation.
Mm-hmm. That's so important that you keep that open mind and that curiosity versus reverting to, I this is the way and I don't want to change and all of that. And I think some of that is also related to being under a lot of stress and just trying to get something done and not wanting to derail the train, if you will.
Yeah.
So when you see that, because I'm sure you have come into many cultures where they're overloaded work wise and everybody's under a lot of stress, and it makes it harder, I think, to be creative. You're not in your
Mm,
best state of mind. You're probably sleep deprived and all kinds of other things. So I love that this sort of starts to introduce a little bit of playfulness
yeah.
into the situation, which hopefully lets people relax into it and be more receptive.
Yeah. Yeah. And it takes a little practice. It takes a little practice. And that's, also the job of folks like me who come in and advise in culture is, because you're right. If you walk up to somebody and while they're in the middle of doing their work and hit them with a question that they need to think about, you're asking a lot of their brain to switch from one thing to the next in real time. Now, as improvisers, we practice how to do that, and it is possible, and it comes with some agility and some time. But I would say that in those situations, it's important to create spaces for those conversations to happen away from the deadlines. And I'm not suggesting that we inundate ourselves with more meetings because God knows we don't need more meetings. But what are some intentional spaces that we can create, right? And it can be around the lunch table. One of my clients has a chalkboard next to the kitchen, and every day they write a fun question on the chalkboard. And sometimes it's work related, but most of the time it's like, what was your favorite Pixar movie? Or what's your least favorite thing about Christmas or whatever. I'm just making these things up, but it's these spaces and opportunities for people to get out of the mind of work, deadlines, stress, and into a more flexible mindset where their amygdala, their fear center, and their fight or flight, get things done, just do the check boxing activity, kind of shuts down a little bit, even for a moment, so that they can hear and see one another in a more relaxed, connective, and like you said, sometimes even a playful way. It can be really huge.
Yeah, I love that you are able to do this. And you describe your work as facilitating. And how is that different from what people might think is going to happen if they hire a consultant?
Yeah, yeah. So there is a consulting part and a facilitation piece to my business. So the facilitation really comes in to, let's say that let's take the values work, for example. So the way that I kick that off, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is it's a half day session that is designed to get people kind of, I like to say, out of their heads and into their stories. So it's designed in a way to get people to, and I'm moving my body around because it's literally getting people to move their bodies, which helps move their minds, use the office space or the Zoom space in ways that aren't as traditional, where we're just sitting in a bubble or a little box and just, you know, doing the thing. So it's designed in a way that's meant to be very interactive and engaging. Yes, very playful. And I don't want that to be nerve-wracking. Some people go, oh boy, she said the word play, but play with intention, purposeful. Yeah, kind of getting people out of that norm in order to come up with ideas that they may not have thought about before. And you can't necessarily, sometimes you can, but you can't necessarily do that unless you're, again, taken out of your normal everyday in a facilitated, safe space, or brave space, as I like to say. And you're kind of, handheld through this experience so that we can come up with things together. And so that's my facilitation kind of expertise. And I use that sporadically through my work as we kind of, the team comes together and then goes back out and comes together and back out. And then the consulting comes with really the change management and the business strategy and all the components of where we're going to dial up and dial down, what's working and what's not working in the employee life cycle across those various touch points, like onboarding and learning and development. So it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of both.
Yeah, yeah, no, that sounds great. And just understanding the different pieces and parts. I don't think most people intuitively identify them, but that's part of what you're doing, is helping them to see those different parts of how they need to be running their company, making sure they're not missing anything, but also making sure they're integrating it all.
Right. Right. Yes. Yeah.
So thank you so much for being my guest today. I really enjoyed this conversation. Lots of really great wisdom here about why we need to be open to change, why we need to focus on authenticity and core values before we do anything else. If someone wants to connect with you, how can they reach you?
Thank you. So my website is enlivenedstudios.com. I'm also all over LinkedIn. It's kind of where I hang out. So I've got some content there as well. And that's Shannon Dean Hughes. So my maiden name's in there, Shannon Dean Hughes. And I also have that download for your listeners, which can be found at my website, enlivenedstudios.com /people first, people first. And the title of that download is 5 Tips to Inspire a People First Culture.
That sounds awesome. Definitely want to
Yeah.
take a look at that.
I
So
hope you do.
everyone, as you know, it's always so valuable to our guests when they hear what you took away from listening to this episode. So definitely feel free to share your insights and to tag Shannon on LinkedIn so that she can hear about what you thought. I know that's always really valuable when people share insights with me. So definitely want to encourage everyone to reach out to Shannon and let her know if you have any questions, or if you are thinking about investing in your company's transition or culture. Now you have a contact.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Angela. This has been such a pleasure. It's so great to connect with you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.